Good morning. Good to be with you. We continue in this season of Easter, a season of hope and resurrection in the midst of the many challenges that we are facing in this time of pandemic and staying at home. Listen now for the reading from John's Gospel today as we open ourselves up to the Spirit. Reading from John chapter 10, beginning in verse 1. Very truly, I tell you, Pharisees, said Jesus, anyone who does not enter the sheep pen by the gate, but climbs in by some other way, is a thief and a robber. The one who enters by the gate is the shepherd of the sheep. The gatekeeper opens the gate for him, and the sheep listen to his voice. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. When he has brought out all his own, he goes on ahead of them, and his sheep will follow him because they know his voice. But they will never follow a stranger. They will run away from him because they do not recognize a stranger's voice. Jesus used this figure of speech, but the Pharisees did not understand what he was telling them. Therefore Jesus said again, very truly I tell you, I am the gate for the sheep. All who have come before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep have not listened to them. I am the gate. Whoever enters through me will be saved. They will come in and go out and find pasture. The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I have come that they may have life and have it abundantly. May God bless our understanding of these words. Let us pause for a moment of prayer. Holy and gracious one, we hear these ancient words. Help us to hear your truth for us, that we might be transformed. Amen. The Lord is my shepherd. Those are very familiar words, and it is a familiar image for many. It is the first line of Psalm 23. On Wednesday of this past week, we had a Zoom gathering of reflections, and I had sent out the text of Psalm 23, both from the King James Version and a more modern version written as song lyrics by Bobby McFerrin. And we had a very interesting conversation about that image and that psalm, that it is powerful and meaningful. And for some, that Psalm 23 is very emotionally wrought. It's connected to times of loss. We may hear it read at funerals. For others, it's a very comforting image. The Lord is my shepherd. There are other translations of that psalm. One comes from Nan Merrill, and the first line is, the beloved is my shepherd. That's also very beautiful. There is a longing for comforting words of this psalm. We talked about how goodness is related to action and that we are invited into that goodness every day. That the presence of God in the beloved is something we long for always and maybe particularly right now. This image of the beloved setting a table with us, being present with us in all times and places, and setting a table for us. That's important. But there was also an awareness that this psalm and this image of God as shepherd reminds us of the images of God is with us even in the valleys of death, in places of anguish and suffering, in this time of the pandemic. So images about shepherds and sheep have been on my mind this week. It's a bit of a leap for us in the year 2020 to be connected with sheep and shepherds. There are some wonderful goats that are currently grazing on the hills in Marin County to munch on those hillside grasses to keep them at a low fire risk. And I've seen some of the wonderful pictures of these goats on the hillsides. They're lovely, but I'm not sure where the sheep are, if there are any in Marin, or where they might be. Let's notice that in John chapter 10, Jesus employs this imagery of first century shepherding in order to reveal something about his identity and his relationship to his followers, including us. Now, the most experience I have had with sheep was when I was in Scotland. First, there was the time when we were on the island of Iona. We were there with our 2 young sons, and one afternoon we ventured to the other side of the island, to the east side, where someone told us that there was a small golf course. Now, none of us golf, but we were game, so we borrowed a few clubs and a few balls and headed out across this tiny island to they told us about this small golf course. We discovered the golf course with 9 holes in the ground with some flat areas and a lot of sheep grazing on the golf course. So as we approached and someone was leaving, they shouted to us, "Watch out for the sheep droppings." They were at every hole. So along with a few cows and the sheep, that was part of our experience with sheep in Scotland. They even wandered around on the golf course. Later in the trip, I was driving our rental car from Pitlochry over to St. Andrews on the eastern coast. And what I remember was, of course, driving on the left, sheep on the left, on the right, grazing on all the hills. And the farther we went, the more narrow the road got, no fences, and just lots of signs. Sheep crossing. Seemed obvious. But the sheep had the right of way, so we wound our way through the hills with sheep on the left and sheep on the right, but no shepherds in sight. So I come to these passages without a lot of background in sheep and shepherds, but I think there are some deep truths that are here. So if you're anything like me, you have no clue about the shepherding practice in Jesus' time, ancient or modern. So in order to access what John was calling about this figure of speech, we need to acknowledge that we have little personal contact with this image that Jesus is offering, and to allow ourselves to use our imagination, to not just be in our head and thinking, I don't know what shepherding was like, but what might the Spirit open up in us as we imagine this scene and this image and this metaphor. So imagine with me a rolling plain in the Middle East, dotted with humps and hillocks, and dusk descends, and the shepherd leads his flock into the sheepfold. One of the hillocks has been hollowed out, and the sheep huddle inside next to the sheep of several other shepherds of this particular fold. And a pair of piled rock walls extends a few feet from the sides of the hill. And the shepherd lies down in the space between the low walls, effectively sealing the enclosure. Thieves and bandits and wolves will have a difficult time getting in with the shepherds on guard. The sheep are safe in the sheepfold. When the shepherd arises the next morning, Jesus explains The shepherd calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. When he has brought out all of his own, he goes on ahead of them, and the sheep follow him because they know his voice. The sheep can't spend their whole lives in the sheepfold, no matter how safe the enclosure may be. There's no food in that sheepfold. So the sheep may be comfortable and safe, but the sheep must follow the shepherd out of the fold to find sustenance to live. In John 10, Jesus says, I am the gate for the sheep. And in verse 11, which I didn't read earlier, he says, I am the good shepherd. Admittedly, the image of Jesus as shepherd makes a far more natural comparison than comparing Jesus to a gate. And I'll say a little more about that later. But how can they be both at the same time? These images get layered on top of each other, an extended metaphor that talks about sheep and shepherd and gate and gatekeeper and strangers and thieves and bandits and wolves. There's a lot going on in these few verses. Jesus begins by describing what he is not. Those who climb into the sheepfold are thieves and bandits who do not care about the sheep, only about their own gain. By contrast, the shepherd enters the sheepfold openly by means of the gate. He is recognized by the sheep who know his voice. And when he calls his sheep by name, they follow him, and he leads them to pasture. The sheep will not follow a stranger, but instead will flee from the one whose voice they don't recognize. So it's interesting how John kind of paints this picture, who Jesus is and who he is not. And there's an interesting verb John uses, they have not known instead of they don't know. It's the perfect tense. And it talks about, it reflects this long relationship between the shepherd and the sheep. This familiarity with his voice. This verb eido is a favorite of John's for knowing and seeing in an ongoing way. And he uses the perfect tense. We lose some of that in the English. One of the things that strikes me about this passage is the voice of the shepherd. This amazing part of the shepherd that sheep recognize the voice of the shepherd and will only follow the shepherd, and the shepherd knows their name. I was reading a little about shepherds and sheep and how early they're imprinted, that the ewes when they're born, this use of the voice of the one who will be calling them, and that early on it's not, and it's also face recognition. It's not the clothes, it's not the words, but the voice and the face. Sheep recognize and will only follow the one who is their shepherd. And they associate the shepherd with all the benefits of food and protection and security and life and trust. Isn't that a beautiful image about hearing our name, to be called by the beloved in love? And this image, this recurring theme in the Bible of being called by name and how that is transforming. To be called in love by name is the way God is at work in the Bible and in the world and in our lives. We're in this season of Easter, and I was thinking again about the Easter story from John of Mary Magdalene. When she gets to the tomb and she's weeping in grief and shock, and she looks inside and the tomb is empty, and she sees these angels, but she doesn't seem to care that they're angels or messengers. She's just in grief, and she says, "They've taken away my Jesus. I don't know where he is." And then she sees this figure, a gardener, she assumes. And she just says again, "Sir, if you have taken him away, tell me, and I will take him back." And he calls her by name, Mary. And with that, her dark world is flooded with light. This Christ is alive in the present tense. Paul's story, Paul, who came to write so many of the books of what are now considered the New Testament, Paul had his eyes opened in a somewhat similar way. There he was, 2 or 3 years after Jesus' death. His name was still Saul. He was a very pious Jew and was trying to snuff out the sect of Jesus' followers. And this bright light knocked him off his horse or camel. And this great voice spoke to him, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" That was the moment that changed everything. He knew who it was because he was known. He was called by name. Most of us won't hear a voice calling our name, but an inner voice who reminds us that we are called by name in love by God. The other thing that kept striking me as I read this passage is this phrase, this image of Jesus saying, "I am the gate." Also in the present tense, I am the gate, I am the good shepherd. I am the gate. So when those words were set to parchment, the writer of John's Gospel was writing this down about 90 AD, almost 60 years after Jesus' death. Those early followers of Jesus' way knew that the resurrection was real. It was real where love was stronger than whatever threatens to scatter or destroy. John wrote those words, "I am the gate, I am the good shepherd." But it's interesting, this word of gate. Jesus calls himself the gate because that was part of what the shepherd was. Remember, as we imagined this scene at the sheepfold, there wasn't a physical gate because the shepherd would lie down at that opening between these small rock walls. It was just open. And the shepherd would lie there as the gate, as the entry and the exit. And in this way, the shepherd knew who came and went, or who attempted to come or go, so the shepherd could protect the sheep. And the function of the gate was to keep the sheep together during the night, safe from thieves and predators. And then during the day, the gate opened, nothing impeding them, so that the sheep had to go out following their shepherd to find pasture. The gate and the shepherd worked together, were one in many respects for the well-being of the sheep, so that the flock would thrive. Jesus as both sheep and shepherd at the same time, guarding and protecting, providing nourishment for their life in abundance. This discourse of Jesus, as John tells the good news, this part of John's Gospel that we have read from chapter 10 follows a section in John where a man was healed from blindness. Had been blind from birth. Jesus put mud on his face, and there was a lot of reaction to this man being blind and being healed. There's not a one-to-one correspondence between the elements of the metaphor and this narrative that follows in John 10, but there are certain associations that give us this bigger context for this story. The Pharisees who have interrogated the blind man in John 9 are supposed to be the shepherds of Israel, those who care for and protect and nourish the people. But instead, they have expelled this blind man from their community, refusing to believe that Jesus and his healing work came from God. They are more concerned about guarding their power and authority than the well-being of the people. They are not acting in ways that good shepherds and good gates should act. And having already restored the sight of the blind man, Jesus seeks him out again, the blind man who's been healed, because he's been expelled from the synagogue, and brings him into community with his followers. And now this man is invited in. He knows he is a valued part of Jesus' flock to be cared for and protected. So Jesus takes this story, this reality of the Pharisees not welcoming this blind man, keeping him out, not acting in faith or welcome. And Jesus said, I am the gate. I open wide. This sense that Jesus as a gate is welcoming, that all people, all sheep are welcome, and that the purpose of the gate is to guard against what all threatens the well-being of the sheep. And he was trying to help the Pharisees see that they were acting as gatekeepers and preventing the well-being of the sheep who were vulnerable. When humans use gates, we tend to use them to separate. But Jesus as the gate is one that opens and allows for connection. Even as this dangerous virus, this coronavirus, feels like a closed gate that's keeping us apart. In Christ, we are connected, and we are doing things that show that our gate is open. A gate to connections and friendships and relationships online, on the phone, safe distance visits. We are connected as a church, as a community. And we are a gate that stays open to realizing there are vulnerable ones, vulnerable sheep in our flock who are hungry. So on Tuesday nights, meals are prepared for those who are living unsheltered or those who have not enough to eat, and meals are being brought to them. So our gate is open because we follow that one who said, I am the gate, and I am welcoming all in. We want to be back together in that sheepfold, worshiping, praying, singing, serving. But it's going to be a little longer, and we want to make sure that everybody can be safely gathered in when it's time to go back. But what will that new sheepfold look like? We're starting to think about that. And there are some things about our life together and our world that are changing. So we'll keep thinking, how are we going to build this new sheepfold? And how do we move in and out? And how do we keep the gate open safely? It's a gate into abundant life, a life that is rooted in love and kindness and compassion and justice, in reaching those who are vulnerable. I've been thinking about that gate. Gates are thresholds. Another word I've been thinking about lately is a liminal space, neither here nor there. Liminality refers to a quality of ambiguity or disorientation that occurs at a time of transition when a person or a group of people is between something that has ended and something else has not yet begun. Transitions involve separation and letting go, this space of being in between, and then a reorientation. You're not going back to what was, but a reorientation to what is and the direction you're going. We as a church, we as a community, we as a country, we as a world are in a liminal season. I'm going to say more about that in the coming weeks. But the Holy One we can trust is right here in this space of the gate, in this threshold, in this not knowing. And together we'll be discerning that. The one who is the gate and shepherd knows us by name, calls us, loves us, is with us, and sends us out and calls us back. Amen.